What would you do if you discovered your dead son had a child you never knew existed? Baroness Jean McPherson is about to find out. At her son's grave, she finds a black gardener sobbing with a girl who has her son's unmistakable eyes. "This is your granddaughter," he says, "but her son died 3 years ago in Boston. How is this possible? And why is this child living in poverty?"
Hello everyone! Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, like the video and share with loved ones, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin.
The life of Baroness Jean McPherson was built on duty, decorum, and distance. At 51, she lived alone in a 4-story Belgravia townhouse that felt more like a tomb than a home. The marble floors echoed with every step. Gas chandeliers illuminated rooms no one entered. Portraits of dead McPhersons lined the walls, their painted eyes following her through hallways that smelled of beeswax and regret. 3 years had passed since her son William died of typhoid fever in Boston. 2 years before that, her husband Baron Thomas McPherson succumbed to heart failure. Jean wore black every single day. Morning dress, black. Afternoon calls, black. Evening solitude, black. Mrs. Dalton, her stern lady's maid, laced her into whalebone corsets each dawn with the efficiency of a jailor. Jean had once been a woman of influence. Garden parties at the townhouse, opera boxes at Covent Garden, charity galas where she smiled and nodded while feeling absolutely nothing. But after William's death, the invitations continued out of obligation, not affection. She attended fewer and fewer. Eventually, she stopped leaving the house altogether except for one occasion. Every April 9th, the anniversary of William's death, Jean made a pilgrimage to Highgate Cemetery. The ritual never changed. Black carriage, white lilies, exactly 1 hour at the grave, no tears in public. She would stand before the McPherson family vault, where William's name was carved in marble beside his father's, and she would silently recite the same prayer. Then she would leave. She never stayed long enough to feel anything real. William had been her only son. Gretchen, her daughter, fled to America 6 years ago after a scandal involving a French tutor. Jean disowned her, calling her reckless and shameful. They hadn't spoken since. So William became everything. Except Jean had never truly known him. She remembered a small boy with auburn curls who collected butterflies and asked too many questions. She remembered a young man who wanted to study medicine, not manage estates. She remembered the day he left for Boston, his face a mixture of relief and sadness. He wrote letters at first, polite, distant letters about his studies. Then the letters stopped. When the telegram arrived 3 years ago, William deceased, typhoid fever, Boston City Hospital. Jean felt the floor disappear beneath her. She sent money for a proper burial in America, but his body was shipped home. She never asked questions. She never wondered why he'd stayed in Boston so long. She simply buried him and retreated into mourning like it was a second skin. Now, on another April 9th, Mrs. Dalton helped her into the carriage. The lilies sat beside her, their white petals perfect and cold. As the carriage rolled through London's crowded streets, John stared out the window. Flower sellers, newspaper boys, nursemaids pushing prams, life continuing as if loss didn't matter. The carriage passed through the gates of Highgate Cemetery beneath Gothic arches covered in ivy. The driver stopped near the Egyptian Avenue. Jean stepped down carrying the lilies. The path wound upward through ancient oaks and crumbling headstones. Then she heard it. Someone was crying. The sound echoed through the stone corridors of the cemetery, raw and unrestrained. Jean hesitated, gripping the lilies tighter. Highgate was usually silent except for bird song and wind through the trees. But this crying was different, the kind that came from deep in the chest, from a place where grief lived without permission. She quickened her pace up the hill, her black skirts sweeping fallen leaves. When she rounded the corner past a row of weathered angels, she stopped cold. A man knelt before William's grave. His shoulders shook with sobs, his face buried in calloused hands. He wore simple work clothes, brown trousers, a worn jacket, mud on his boots. Beside him sat a small girl, perhaps 7 years old, carefully arranging pebbles into the shape of a cross on the grass. Her purple coat was too thin for the April chill. Her brown curly hair was tied with a frayed ribbon. Jean's breath caught. This was her private place. Her ritual. Her son. "Excuse me," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "This is my son's grave. Who are you?" The man startled and looked up. His face was tear-streaked, his eyes red and swollen. He was black, perhaps 30 years old, with kind features worn down by something heavier than age. He rose slowly, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice hoarse. "I didn't mean to intrude. My name is Michael Rigby. I work here, tending the graves." "That doesn't explain why you're crying at my son's headstone," Jean replied coldly, though something in her chest tightened at the genuine anguish in his expression. The little girl looked up then, and Jean's world tilted. The child had hazel eyes flecked with gold, auburn curls that caught the morning light, a delicate jaw with a slight point at the chin. Every feature was hauntingly, impossibly familiar. Michael followed Jean's gaze and placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "This is Franca," he said quietly. "Why does she—" Jean couldn't finish the sentence. Her hands trembled, and the lilies slipped, scattering across the grave. Michael took a deep breath, his voice steady despite the tears still wet on his face. "Because Franca is William's daughter, ma'am. She's your granddaughter." The words hung in the air like smoke. "Impossible," Jean whispered. But even as she said it, she couldn't look away from the child's face. It was William at 6 years old, the same age he'd been when she'd stopped reading him bedtime stories because the Baron said it would make him soft. Franca tilted her head, studying Jean with open curiosity. "Are you my grandmother?" she asked, her voice small and clear as a bell. Jean staggered backward, her vision blurring. "This cannot be. William never, he would have told me." "He wanted to," Michael said gently. "But he was afraid." "Afraid? Of what?" Michael met her eyes. "Of you, ma'am." Jean didn't sleep that night. She lay in her vast bed, staring at the canopy above, seeing only Franca's face. Those eyes, William's eyes. By dawn, she'd made a decision. She summoned Mr. Pembroke, a private investigator her late husband had once used for business matters. "I need you to verify a story," she said, handing him Michael Rigby's name and address, quickly and thoroughly. 3 days later, Pembroke returned with a folder thick with documents. Marriage certificate from Boston City Hall, May 1883. William Alexander McPherson wed to Comfort May Henriksen. Birth certificate, Franca Comfort McPherson, born March 1880. Death certificates, Comfort Henriksen, October 1884, typhoid fever. William McPherson, April 1885, typhoid fever. Passenger records showing Michael Rigby and Franca arriving in Liverpool, June 1885. Every word was true. Jean sat in her drawing room, the papers spread before her like accusations. Her son had married, had a child, lived an entire life she knew nothing about. The betrayal burned, but beneath it was something worse. Understanding. William had hidden his life because he knew she wouldn't accept it. She called for Mrs. Dalton. 3 years ago, Jean said, her voice dangerously quiet, when my son died. Did any letters arrive from Boston after the telegram? Mrs. Dalton's face went carefully blank. I don't recall, my lady. Don't lie to me. The maid's composure cracked. There was one letter, my lady, from the hospital. I thought it best not to burden you with. What did you do with it? I burned it, Mrs. Dalton whispered, to protect the family name, to spare you further pain. Jean stood, trembling with rage. You burned my son's final words. Pack your things. You're dismissed. After Mrs. Dalton left, Jean sat in the silence of her massive house and wept. For William, for the 3 years she could have known Franca, for the grandmother she might have been. The next morning she traveled to Whitechapel. Michael's lodging house was a crumbling brick building that smelled of boiled cabbage and damp. She climbed 3 narrow flights of stairs and knocked on a door with peeling paint. Michael opened it, shock crossing his face. Lady McPherson, may I come in? The room was tiny, one bed, a small table, a corner where Franca's few belongings were neatly arranged. On the wall hung a photograph. William smiling broadly, his arm around a beautiful black woman with gentle eyes. Both of them looked radiantly happy. If this story is moving you, subscribe to the channel. What happens next will break your heart and then put it back together. You won't want to miss it. That's Comfort, Michael said softly, following Jean's gaze. My sister. Jean sank into the room's only chair. Tell me everything. I need to know who my son really was. Michael made tea on a small spirit stove while Jean sat surrounded by the evidence of her son's secret life. He moved carefully, as if afraid she might shatter or flee. William came to Boston in 1882, Michael began, handing her a chipped cup. He was studying at Harvard Medical School. Brilliant student, they said, but lonely. He came to the church where Comfort and I sang in the choir. She was a seamstress, took in work from the theater district. How did they meet? Jean asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He tore his coat on a fence. Someone recommended Comfort for the mending. He brought it to her shop, and she made him laugh. William said he hadn't laughed in years. He kept inventing reasons to return. Torn buttons, loose hems. Finally, he just asked if he could walk her home. Michael pulled out a small wooden box. Inside were letters, all in William's careful handwriting. Jean recognized it immediately, the same script from his childhood compositions. She unfolded one with trembling hands. Dearest Comfort, Mother would never understand you, not because of your station or your heritage, though those would be obstacles enough, but because she doesn't understand love that asks nothing in return. She raised me to see marriage as transaction, alliance, duty. You taught me it could be joy. I'm terrified to tell her about us, not because I'm ashamed. God, I've never been prouder of anything, but because I know I'll have to choose. And I've already chosen you. Tears blurred the words. He loved her, Jean whispered. Desperately, Michael confirmed. They married quietly. Franca was born a year later. William was completing his residency, working impossible hours, but every free moment he spent with them. I've never seen a man more devoted. Then why didn't he come home? Why didn't he at least write? Michael's expression darkened. He tried, my lady. He wrote you twice, telling you about Comfort. Both letters came back unopened, marked "Return to sender" by your household. Jean closed her eyes. Mrs. Dalton, of course. The typhoid epidemic hit Boston's immigrant neighborhoods hardest. Michael continued, his voice thick. Comfort contracted it first. She died within days. William nursed her himself, barely sleeping. Then he fell ill too. Before he died, he made me promise, swore me to it, that I'd bring Franca to England. He said, my mother is cold, but she's not cruel. Once she sees Franca, she'll love her. She has to. But I never knew, Jean said, her voice breaking. For 3 years, I never knew. I tried, my lady. 3 times I came to your house. Each time, the servants turned me away. They said you weren't receiving visitors, that I should leave or they'd call the police. I couldn't risk, he gestured helplessly. I'm a black man with a mixed child. The police don't ask questions. Jean arranged to see Franca the following Saturday, not in Whitechapel's cramped room or the cemetery's cold marble, but somewhere softer, Hyde Park, near the Serpentine. Franca arrived in her threadbare purple coat, holding Michael's hand tightly. When she saw Jean, she offered a shy curtsy that was both clumsy and endearing. Hello, grandmother, she said carefully, as if testing the word. Something cracked open in Jean's chest. Hello, Franca. They walked slowly around the lake. Franca asked questions with startling directness. Did my father like sweets? Did he have a doe? Why did he go so far away? Jean answered as honestly as she could, though each question revealed how little she'd truly known her own son. Franca showed her a silver locket she wore. Inside was a tiny curl of auburn hair. Michael says it's from when I was a baby. Father kept it with him always. Over the next 2 weeks, Jean commissioned a dressmaker to create proper clothing for Franca. She invited her to the townhouse, where the girl explored William's preserved childhood room with reverent wonder, touching his medical books and old sketches. Then Jean decided to take her to tea at Fortnum and Mason. It was meant to be a gesture of normalcy, of acceptance. Franca wore a new cream dress with lace trim. Jean had arranged her hair properly. They were seated at a corner table, and Franca's eyes went wide at the tiered pastries. "May I try the pink one?" she whispered. "You may have whichever you like," Jean replied, warmth flooding through her. Then Lady Constance Fairfax appeared. She was a pillar of London society, a woman whose approval could make or destroy reputations. Her eyes swept over their table and landed on Franca with undisguised revulsion. "Jean, darling," Lady Fairfax said, her voice dripping false sweetness. "How charitable of you. Though I must say taking tea with them seems rather excessive. Surely a donation to their mission house would suffice." Franca's face crumbled. She understood the tone, even if not all the words. Her small hands clenched in her lap. Jean felt ice flood her veins, not fear, but fury. She stood slowly, drawing herself to full height. "Lady Fairfax, allow me to introduce Miss Franca Macpherson, my son William's daughter, my granddaughter. If her presence at this table offends your delicate sensibilities, you are welcome to leave. We were here first." The tea room went silent. Every head turned. Lady Fairfax's face flushed crimson. "You cannot be serious." "I have never been more serious in my life," Jean said, her voice cold as marble. "Good day." Lady Fairfax turned and swept out, her skirts snapping with indignation. Jean sat back down, her hands trembling slightly. Franca stared at her with wide, wondering eyes. "You stood up for me," the girl whispered. "Always," Jean replied. "I will always stand up for you." By evening, the scandal had spread through every drawing room in Belgravia. The letters arrived first. Anonymous, vicious, slipped under the door or delivered by servants who wouldn't meet Jean's eyes. "Race traitor! Disgrace to your class! That child is an abomination!" Jean burned them all, but the words left ash in her mouth. Invitations stopped coming. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. The butcher's boy smirked when he delivered orders to the servants' entrance. Jean Macpherson, once untouchable, had become London's favorite scandal. Then the telegram arrived from Southampton. "Heard the news, arriving Thursday. G. Gretchel, her daughter, the child she disowned 6 years ago for loving the wrong man." Jean stood on the Southampton docks as the steamship from New York came into port, her heart hammering against her ribs. When Gretchel descended the gangplank, she looked older, 33 now, her dark hair pinned elegantly, her burgundy traveling suit clearly expensive. Beside her walked a slender man with kind eyes and a neat beard, Pascal Fournier, the French tutor who'd ruined everything, except he wore a wedding ring. So did Gretchel. "Mother," Gretchel said, stopping 3 feet away. Not close enough to embrace, not far enough to ignore. "Gretchel," Jean's voice caught, "you came. I heard you're being destroyed for acknowledging a grandchild society finds inconvenient." Gretchel's tone was measured, careful. It seemed familiar. The accusation hung between them like smoke. They returned to Belgravia in tense silence. Inside the drawing room, Pascal excused himself tactfully, leaving mother and daughter alone for the first time in 6 years. "You cast me out," Gretchel said without preamble. "You called me shameful, reckless. You said I destroyed the family name by loving a man beneath my station. Do you remember?" "I remember," Jean whispered. "And now you're shocked that William hid his life from you? That he married in secret and never told you about his child?" Gretchel's voice rose. "You taught us that your approval mattered more than our happiness. That reputation was everything. William learned that lesson, Mother. He just didn't survive it." The words struck like physical blows. Jean sank into a chair, her carefully maintained composure finally shattering. "You're right, God help me, you're right about all of it." "Then why?" Gretchel demanded, tears streaming now. "Why are you fighting for Franca when you wouldn't fight for me?" "Because I can't undo what I did to you," Jean said, her voice breaking. I can't bring William back, but I can refuse to make the same mistake 3 times. I was wrong, Gretchel. I was cruel and cowardly, and I destroyed my relationship with both my children because I cared more about what strangers thought than what you needed. Subscribe now so you don't miss what happens next. Because this family's battle for acceptance is far from over, and the hardest choice is still to come. Gretchel wiped her eyes roughly. Then stop repeating the pattern. Fight for Franca the way you should have fought for me. 2 weeks after Gretchel's return, a formal letter arrived bearing the seal of Lord Reginald Fairburn, William's uncle and the Baron's younger brother. Jean broke the wax with shaking hands. I am contesting the legitimacy of the child claiming to be William's heir. The American marriage has no standing under English law. The estate and trust funds will be transferred to proper family control. You are making a fool of yourself, John. End this charade before the courts do it for you. Michael received his own summons, the same though they were being taken to court. The proceedings began at Lincoln's Inn in late June. The courtroom was all dark wood and high ceilings, designed to make ordinary people feel small. Lord Reginald sat with his solicitors, 3 men in black robes who looked at Michael as if he were something scraped off their shoes. Jean took the witness stand first. Lord Reginald's barrister, Mr. Thornton, approached with predatory precision. Lady Macpherson, are you aware that acknowledging this child publicly has made you a social pariah? I am, Jean said clearly. Yet you persist? I do. Is it possible, Thornton said, his voice oily with false concern, that grief has clouded your judgment? That this man, he gestured dismissively toward Michael, has taken advantage of a vulnerable widow with convenient documents and a child of ambiguous parentage? My granddaughter's parentage is not ambiguous, Jean replied, steel in her voice. She has her father's eyes, his features, his gentle spirit. Anyone who knew William would see it immediately. Coincidence can be striking, Thornton countered. Resemblance proves nothing. Then Michael took the stand. Thornton circled him like a vulture. Mr. Rigby, you're a gardener. Your annual income is what, 40 pounds? Closer to 38, sir, Michael said quietly. 38 pounds. And you expect this court to believe you've spent 3 years raising a child out of pure charity? That you have no interest in the Macpherson fortune? I raised Franca because I promised my best friend I would protect his daughter, Michael said, his voice steady despite the hostile stares. William was like a brother to me. I don't want the Macpherson money. I never have. How convenient, Thornton sneered. A poor black man with no prospects suddenly appears with a convenient story and a well-coached child. That's enough, the judge interrupted sharply. But the damage was done. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Then Michael reached into his jacket. I have something, Your Honor. Something I kept hidden for fear it would be stolen or destroyed. He produced a letter, yellowed and creased from being carried close to his heart. This is the letter William wrote to Lady Macpherson from his deathbed. The original. He gave me a copy before the hospital sent hers. I kept it safe. The judge took the letter, read it slowly, his expression shifted. This court finds in favor of Miss Franca Macpherson, he declared. Her legitimacy is established. The legal victory felt hollow. Jean returned to her Belgravia townhouse to find another brick thrown through the window, this time wrapped in a note. Your Negro-loving days are numbered. Leave London. The servants gave notice, one by one. The grocer refused her custom. Former friends sent their cards back torn in half. Jean Macpherson had won in court, but lost everything else. She sat alone in the drawing room as gas lamps flickered, casting shadows across walls that seemed to press inward. The house felt enormous and suffocating all at once. No visitors, no dinners, no purpose. On the sideboard sat a small brown bottle, laudanum. She'd relied on it after William died, just a few drops to quiet the screaming silence in her head. Now she held it, feeling its weight. How easy it would be. Just sleep. No more judgment. No more fighting. No more pain. She uncorked the bottle. Don't. Michael stood in the doorway, Franca behind him clutching her hand. He must have used the servant's entrance. No one had answered the front door in days. How did you, Jean began. The girl at the corner sent word you'd dismissed the last servant, Michael said quietly, crossing the room. He took the bottle gently from her hands. William wouldn't want this. William is dead, Jean said bitterly, tears streaming. And I've destroyed everything for a child who barely knows me. I have nothing left. You haven't lost everything, Michael said, kneeling before her chair. You've lost people who valued your title more than your heart. But Franca values you. Gretchen came back. You have a choice, my lady. Die alone in this tomb, or live in a smaller house with a real family. Franca had been standing quietly, but now she ran forward, throwing her arms around Jean's waist. Grandmother, please don't be sad, she said, her voice muffled against Jean's dress. I don't need big houses or fancy parties. I just need you. Please stay. The simplicity shattered something inside Jean. She pulled Franca close, burying her face in the child's hair, and sobbed, great heaving sobs she'd held back for years. For William, for Gretchen, for the decades she'd wasted chasing approval from people who never truly cared. When the tears finally subsided, Jean looked up at Michael. I can't stay here. This house is killing me. Then leave it, he said simply. Where would I go? Anywhere you choose, Michael replied. Gretchen mentioned a cottage in the Cotswolds, small, quiet, a place to breathe. Jean looked around the cavernous room at the portraits of stern ancestors who demanded perfection and given nothing in return. Yes, she whispered. I'll sell it. All of it. Franca looked up, eyes bright. Will we live together? If you'll have me, Jean said, smoothing the child's hair. Always, Franca whispered back. For the first time in years, Jean felt something other than grief. She felt hope. Spring arrived late in the Cotswolds that year, but when it came, it transformed the valley into a canvas of wild green and gold. Jean stood in the garden of Rose Cottage, her hands deep in rich earth, planting white lilac saplings alongside Franca. The cottage was modest, stone walls, a thatched roof, 3 small bedrooms, but the morning light poured through leaded windows in a way the Belgravia townhouse never had. Will they grow tall, grandmother? Franca asked, patting soil around a sapling's roots. In time, Jean said, sitting back on her heels. Her dress was simple cotton now, no corset strangling her breath, no jewels weighing down her neck. Your father loved white lilacs. He said they smelled like hope. 2 years had passed since they'd left London. 2 years of learning to live without servants, without society, without the suffocating weight of reputation. Jean had sold the townhouse and most of its contents, keeping only William's medical books, a few photographs, and his mother's music box. The money had bought this cottage, established trust funds for Franca's education, and provided Michael with the capital to accept a position as head gardener at Ashworth Manor, the estate just beyond the village. Lord Ashworth was an eccentric botanist who cared more about rare orchids than bloodlines, and he paid Michael fairly, something almost unheard of. Tea's ready, Gretchen called from the doorway, her French accent still thick after all these years. She and Pascal had taken a cottage in the neighboring village of Lower Slaughter, close enough to visit daily, but far enough to give Jeanne space to rebuild herself. They gathered around the small kitchen table. Jean, Franca, Gretchen, Pascal, and Michael, who'd stopped by after finishing his morning rounds. The table was crowded, elbows bumping, nothing like the formal dinners of John's old life. And it was perfect. Franca, show your grandmother what you wrote, Gretchen urged, eyes twinkling. Franca pulled a folded paper from her pinafore pocket, suddenly shy. It's just a poem, for school. Read it, darling, Jean said gently. Franca's voice was small but steady. Fathers live in lilac blooms, in gentle hands that chase the glooms, in uncles' songs and gardens care, in grandmothers who learn to dare, not in marble, cold and white, but in the warmth of morning light. Silence filled the kitchen. Then Pascal began to clap, and the others joined in. Franca's cheeks flushed with pleasure. William would be proud, Michael said quietly, and Jean nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. That afternoon, Jean walked to the village. She still felt eyes following her sometimes. The Baroness who'd fallen from grace, living like a commoner with her mixed-race granddaughter. But the whispers here were different than London's venom. Curiosity mostly, and gradually grudging respect. Mrs. Pettigrew at the bakery had started saving the day's best scones for Franca. The vicar's wife had invited Jean to join the church ladies' charitable committee. Young Tom at the blacksmith's always tipped his cap respectfully to Michael. It wasn't acceptance exactly, but it was something warmer than tolerance. Franca attended the village school now, and while some mothers kept their daughters apart from her, others had begun inviting her to play. Just last week, she'd come home breathless, telling Jean about helping Sarah Miller rescue a bird's nest from a storm. "Sarah says I'm clever," Franca had announced proudly. "She wants to sit next to me at lessons." Small victories, but they meant everything. On a bright Saturday in May, they made the journey back to London, the first time since leaving. The purpose was singular: to visit William's grave. The train ride was long, and Franca pressed her face to the window, marveling at the countryside giving way to the city's gray sprawl. Jean felt her chest tighten as familiar landmarks appeared. St. Pancras, the Thames, the spires of Westminster. But she didn't feel the old pull. London was a place she'd escaped, not a home she'd lost. At Highgate Cemetery, they walked together through the Egyptian Avenue, past the weathered angels and elaborate tombs of families still imprisoned by their own importance. William's headstone was modest compared to those around it. Jean had replaced the original after the court case. This one bore a new inscription: William Henry McPherson, 1854 to 1884, beloved son, husband, father, healer. He chose love over fear. Fresh flowers already rested at its base. Jean looked at Michael questioningly. "I still visit when I'm in London," he said softly. "Comfort's buried in Boston. But William felt like family even before I knew about Franca. He was kind to my sister when kindness cost him everything." Jean knelt, placing white lilacs beside Michael's roses. Franca stood between them, one small hand in Jean's, the other in Michael's. "Tell me about my father," Franca said, as she often did. This time it was easier. "He was brilliant," Jean began. "Stubborn as a mule, mind you, always questioning everything, always pushing boundaries." She smiled through tears. "When he was 7, he brought a stray dog home and announced he was going to be a doctor for animals and people. I told him that was impossible. He did it anyway, the rascal." Michael added, "He met your mother at a lecture on public health. She was arguing with the professor about sanitation in poor neighborhoods, and William joined in. They were married within the year, scandalizing everyone." He paused. "Your mother was magnificent, Franca, fierce and compassionate. William said marrying her was the first truly brave thing he'd ever done." "Why didn't he tell grandmother about her?" Franca asked, the question that still hurt most. Jean took a breath. "Because I failed him, sweetheart. I taught him that my approval mattered more than his happiness. That reputation was more important than love." She looked at the headstone. "But he was braver than I was. He chose his own path anyway." "Are you angry he didn't tell you?" Franca asked. "No," Jean said, and meant it. "I'm angry at myself for being someone he couldn't tell, but I'm trying to become someone worthy of his memory." Gretchen, who'd been standing quietly beside Pascal, spoke up. "William used to defend me, you know, when I was disowned." Her voice was thick. "He wrote me letters in New York, told me to live boldly, to never apologize for loving Pascal. He said," she wiped her eyes, "he said our mother would come around eventually, that she just needed time to remember what mattered. He was wrong about the timing," Jean said softly, "but right about the rest." They stood together in silence as birdsong filled the cemetery air. Finally, Franca reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded paper, her poem from that morning. "Can I leave this here?" she asked. "Of course, darling." Franca placed it carefully beneath the flowers, weighing it down with a smooth stone she'd carried from the cottage garden. "Goodbye, Papa," she whispered. "I wish I'd known you. But grandmother tells me stories now, and Uncle Michael too, and Aunt Gretchen. So maybe I do know you, a little bit." They walked away together, 5 figures moving through dappled sunlight toward the cemetery gates. Behind them, the marble tombs stood frozen in time, monuments to people who'd valued permanence over truth. But ahead lay the train back to the Cotswolds, back to Rose Cottage, back to a life built on honesty instead of appearance. Jean paused at the gates, looking back one last time. "What are you thinking, Maman?" Gretchen asked gently. "That I spent 40 years building a beautiful prison," Jean said, "and 2 years learning what it means to be free." Franca tugged her hand. "Are we free now, grandmother?" Jean looked down at her granddaughter, this brave, brilliant child who'd given her a reason to live differently, to choose love over fear, to become someone new. "Yes, darling," she said, squeezing Franca's hand. "We're free." As they walked toward the waiting carriage, Jean felt the weight of the past finally lifting. She would never be welcomed back into society's drawing rooms. Her name would remain tarnished in the circles she'd once dominated. But she had Franca's laughter, Gretchel's forgiveness, Michael's quiet friendship, a garden where white lilacs would bloom. She had, at last, become the mother William had needed her to be, even if she could only offer that love now to his daughter. Some inheritances, she had learned, are more valuable than estates and titles. Love, courage, the choice to change. These were the gifts she could finally give. In every life, there comes a moment when we must choose between the approval of others and the truth of our own hearts. Jean McPherson's story reminds us that it's never too late to choose love, even when that choice costs us everything we thought we needed. Her grandson's grave became the place where she finally learned to live. Have you ever had to choose between fitting in and standing up for what's right? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If stories of courage, redemption, and second chances resonate with you, subscribe for more powerful narratives that challenge us to examine our own prejudices and celebrate the families we choose. New stories every week, because the most important revolutions often begin in a single brave heart.
If you enjoyed this story, we appreciate you a whole lot and look forward to connecting with you as we build a community on this channel. Every day, we will put out more stories, so we need your support. Help us by liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel if you haven't already. You won't miss any new exciting videos. Check out the next video. You'll love it!